Hello again, Dr. Hargrove. This time I'm talking about my second essay for History 2420, which is African Nationalism and Christian Missionaries, an Imperial Paradox. I refer to it as a paradox because in some ways the advent of Christian missionaries, you could say they were very successful on a purely religious level, as today in Africa there's something in the neighborhood of 400 million Christians, which certainly would not have been the case if Europeans had not intervened in the continent. But from another standpoint, it proved to be absolutely disastrous and, in fact, could be thought to have hastened the revolutionary and independence movements of the mid-20th century. As we know from history, proselytization is one of the fundamental tenets of Christianity, which, it's people are instructed to go out and convert people of other faiths, usually considered to be primitive or, not Western in any way. And church leaders knew that it wasn't enough just to teach the Bible. In fact, more education was needed. So along with these missionary settlements that began to dot the coast in the 15th century, they began to make schools as well, focusing on religion, but also teaching them English or French or whichever language was the mother tongue of the colony, so to speak. Missionary schools, in fact, were not only widespread, but by far the dominant educational sources in colonial Africa. In fact, in 1942, 97% of the school population in Nigeria were in missionary schools. The same in Ghana by 1950, 97%. One of the examples in which the missionary education was a double-edged sword was in perhaps the most fundamental part of education, which is communication. Throughout the history of Africa, language barriers have kept people apart since time immemorial. There's 1,000 years ago, even if they, had both emerged from Bantu-speaking people, it's unlikely that someone from Ghana could have communicated with someone from Ethiopia. Well, that changed with the advent of missionary schools, and people could communicate with each other that they couldn't before, and this led to commiseration and sort of mutual understanding and seeing how things are over here. And this increased communication led to what would eventually become the anti-Christian and anti-white bias. Young Africans began to see the missionary schools as a tool of European oppression. And in fact, many, if not most, of the members of the African National Congress formed in the 50s, or perhaps before, were taught in missionary schools. Basically, the Europeans were in a sort of damned if they do, damned if they don't position regarding education in order to be a colonizer that can successfully subjugate the indigenous people. You have to educate them enough for them to assimilate in some way into your society in Europe, but not so much that they gain an understanding of the injustice they lived under. And that was the case particularly in the South and throughout the rest of the continent, as well as many of these independence nationalism movements sprang out of that resentment and really proved that the missionary education, while I think was a bit of a compromise from the standpoint of the Europeans, I think it can be argued that it actually hastened the inevitable rise of nationalism and the loss of Africa to Europe. My sources are some papers by Edward Berman in African Studies Review, George Reed in Phylon, Donovan Williams in the Journal of African History. For this paper, I chose some older sources. These were all from the 60s and the 70s. I'm sure if I had sought out some newer sources, I'm sure there would be some new perspectives. But I was more interested in seeing what the common thought was, in the immediate aftermath of the independence movements of the 20th century. Overall, the legacy of Christian missionaries in Africa is a mixed bag. They were successful in converting many Africans to Christianity, a legacy that stands today, but they also contributed to the downfall of European domination. So, yeah. Thank you.